James from the Centre of Higher Education Research and Development at the University of Manitoba, and I'd like to welcome you to Leadership in the Midst of a Black Swan Event. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to attend. I realize all of us are managing multiple priorities. I'd like to begin by saying that we acknowledge the treaty lands and unceded territories on which many of us have the privilege of living and working. University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Before we move to the introductions, I'd just like to take a minute to have an overview of the processes and protocols. Please, if you've not already done so, disable your video and audio functions for the duration of the webinar. One correction too is the webinar will run for 75 minutes. That will be till 1:15 Central Daylight Time in Manitoba. And during this time, the panelists will respond to 6 questions. We recognize that you'll have questions and comments too, so we'll address these after question 3, when we'll have a break and curated questions, and subsequently after question 6. Please post your questions and comments within the chat function, and these questions will be curated. The webinar will be recorded and it'll be available on the CHURD website shortly. We'll be sending you out this information and a short feedback form, and we'd really appreciate your input. Finally, I'd like to thank Tara DeCastro, the Program Coordinator in Extended Education, for her ongoing support for the webinars and really enabling these new initiatives to take place. Now I'd like to introduce the panelists and the moderator. Beginning with our panelists, we have Dr. Tom Chase, the Interim President and Vice Chancellor, University of Regina. We have Dr. Adam Gaudry, Associate Dean, Research and Graduate Studies, Faculty of Native Studies, University of Alberta. We have Ms. Jonna Janiak, Vice Principal, Finance and Administration, Queen's University. Dr. George McLean, Vice President Academic, University of New Brunswick, and Dr. Miles Turnbull, Vice Principal Academic, Bishop's University. I'd also like to welcome our moderator, a well-known instructor and collaborator with CHURD, Dr. Sheila Brown, President Emerita, Mount St. Vincent University, and a higher education consultant. So I'll take this time to turn it over to you now, Sheila, to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome to everyone. And I'm happy to get things underway right away. And we'll start with our first question, which concerns the governance changes at both the Senate and the board level that were implemented to ensure that good governance continued while a whole series of decisions were made about how to best function in the current climate. And I'm going to ask Tom Chase to start us off, please.
Thanks, Sheila. Good day to everyone from Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 lands here in Saskatchewan. Delighted to be with you today. There were not a great deal of shifts in the governance mechanisms. What we had to do was to ensure that we were observing all of the necessary rules and regulations with regard to meetings. So we had to approve on several bodies a change from in-person requirements to Zoom and so on and so forth. But the basic governance functions of the university continue to run. And I would say our experience so far since this broke in March is that participation, the number of people who come into the meetings and stay in the meetings for the full period, has actually increased on Zoom from a normal attendance at something like Executive of Council in person. It's working well, and later on I want to describe to you some of the things that we're doing with our board, but right now, no major changes to governance, simply the fact that we're working remotely.
Thank you, Tom. That's very interesting that attendance has increased over this period, and maybe that should tell us something right there. Donna, I'm going to call on you next to say a few words from your perspective.
Great, thank you, and welcome everyone. And I'd also like to welcome you from the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories here in Kingston. So we did have a few things that were changed on the Senate side. At the March Senate meeting, we did take a motion to Senate to delegate authority to the Senate Committee on Academic Procedures. It's a subcommittee of Senate, the ability to make ongoing adjustments to facilitate course completion, such as adjustments to sessional dates. And so that motion was passed at Senate, and it actually it was the March 24th meeting, and it went retroactive to the 16th, which was the last day of in-person classes, and went to the end of December. So allowing for that ability for the Senate Committee on Academic Procedures to make changes up until the end of the fall term. And so that was a delegation of responsibility, but Senate at that meeting did ask to be kept up to date on any changes that were made. And so in the May meeting, we did bring to Senate changes to our fall break date and some other sessional changes, so that Senate was kept apprised, but Senate was not making the approvals. It was delegated to that subcommittee. The other thing that we did, and this we did on the board level, there weren't any changes in delegations of responsibilities at the board level of governance, but at on both governance levels, on the board and on Senate, they asked for regular updates throughout the summer, and so we actually, I think this week or next week, we're having that Senate update. So it's not a regular meeting, not with an agenda, but really just for the principal and the vice principals of provost to give an update on what's happening on campus. And the same thing happened at the board level. So, not regularly scheduled meetings and no agendas, but an ability for our trustees to ask questions and for us to give an update. And the same with Senate. That will happen shortly. We did have one for board last week. So I think those are the changes that happened at Queen's in terms of governance.
Thank you very much, Dana. And I think one of the points you've made is well worth emphasizing, that even if there are no regular meetings, the flow of information to the governance bodies and to the community more broadly is absolutely critical. So for a third speaker on this question of governance, I'm going to call on George McLean.
Thanks very much, Sheila. And it's a real pleasure to be on the Fredericton campus of UNB, which sits on unsurrendered and unceded traditional Wolastoqey land. Our experience at UNB has been somewhat similar to the previous examples that you've heard. We are a bi-campus university, and we have two senates. So the relationship in our governance structures has that added component to it. One interesting aspect with regard to how we went about our business after the university was shut down was that our first meetings of board and our first meetings for the Senate, in fact, had to get permission to use online access and online platforms in the first place. So we had a very strange first Senate meeting on both campuses where we had to have permission to go ahead with Zoom and then move on from there. Because there wasn't anything in our UNB Act that allowed for anything other than in-person meetings. So that's one thing that changed. We now have an opportunity to use other than in-person meetings. Like the other examples, all of our governance structure meetings, committees, et cetera, are continuing to move on an online format. And they've been, actually, I would say, moving forward quite well, in fact. And our experience has been a positive one. Other types of meetings that we've had involving our university community, including a town hall meeting a couple of weeks ago, which attracted over 800 people, whereas we would normally expect maybe 100 to 200 people, shows, as Tom pointed out, the growth in interest, I think, in these types of online and more interactive events and meetings. And in terms of the amount of feedback that we got from those individuals participating in those events, it was very much enhanced too. Hundreds of questions coming from students, staff, and faculty, which we weren't able to answer, of course, during those meetings. And so we've been curating them and putting them on an online platform and trying to respond to all of those questions, which in turn has even created more feedback and input. We also created special committees to deal specifically with the COVID pandemic response. So we created a bi-campus steering committee, and the Senates gave that committee authority for a 6-month period to make decisions that would move towards recommendations to the vice presidents and then ultimately to the president's executive team. We created subcommittees on academic affairs made up of faculties to provide that recommendation, which would be part of the information that goes to the vice presidents. And then created smaller groups as well, advisory groups for the president, which meet on a weekly basis, and establishing a timeline for all of these so that early in September, there will be an opportunity to revisit this experience with the board and the Senates to decide whether the groups would like to move ahead or move in a different direction. So that's a bit of an example of how we've gone about things in our bi-campus environment.
Thank you, George. We started with a question on governance because it's such an important part of how we function as universities. So it's interesting to hear what continued to proceed as much as possible, even with using different media, and what changed in terms of delegations. So with that in mind as a kind of foundation for our discussion, I'd like to shift the focus a little bit and talk about how our presenters engaged with employee groups, employee associations, to ensure that there was a good understanding of any changes to normal procedure that were implemented. And for that, I'd like to call on our other two panelists, starting with Miles Turnbull.
Thank you, Sheila. Bonjour tout le monde. And I'm pleased to be and honored to be working on and living on Abenaki territory in Lennoxville, Québec. Je suis tout à fait ouvert à répondre à des questions en français si on a des participants francophones aussi. So to respond specifically to Sheila's question, at Bishops, for the first time in its history, we enacted electronic voting of Senate. And throughout that process, many of the policy changes that occurred had potential impacts on working conditions for our faculty and staff. I engaged in regular informal meetings with our union president. 2, I had a small informal executive group of Senate. 4, and I consulted these faculty members before making changes to our academic regulations at Senate, but I also proactively consulted the union president on each one of them. And some would say that's dangerous territory, but I did this proactively, and it worked very well, very much in helping maintain calm and equilibrium in our labor relations and in our working conditions at the university. Bishops I created and chaired a task force or working group to examine our decisions about our fall and winter delivery for the 2021 academic year, and I proactively invited the union president and a representative from our part-time union to sit on that working group along with other faculty members, staff, and managers. And that has served us very well. I also, for the first 3 weeks of the post-pandemic, we closed down officially on the 14th of March, and I wrote Monday to Friday a daily message to faculty members, sometimes updating them on every single change that was coming down the pipes through Senate, etc. I then decided that was a bit much. It was a bit too much pressure on myself. They came to expect that a regular everyday message. Where's Miles' message when I missed one day? And I've since taken to communicating both with faculty and with the union when there was something new to address, rather than sending them platitudes every day. Not that it was platitudes. I think that's it for now.
Okay, thank you, Miles. And I notice in some of the communications that we have seen from employee groups over the last few weeks, there has been an emphasis on continuing to be consulted, to be given an opportunity to contribute to the discussions around decision making, and for governance procedures and institutions to be respected. Adam, may I call on you to also share your perspective on that particular question?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Hello, everyone from Amiskwaci, Waskagan, and Treaty 6 and Métis Homeland. Yeah, so the constituent group I work with primarily are graduate students, but I think students also have I think in a lot of ways, the kind of similar pressures to employees. I think where grad students in particular feel challenges that where a lot of people can kind of see what the outcome is at the end of this, I think a lot of graduate students and students with bigger kind of projects can't. And I think there's a lot of, in particular, communication that with students can be effective ways to kind of counteract a lot of the anxiety that I think students face. And so, you know, I think in the early days of this, there was kind of a deficit of information, and that people were really craving information as much as they could get. And now we're kind of in like this opposite situation where there's a ton of information and people are very fatigued by it. And I get the feeling that not everybody's reading it. And I get a lot of questions that, you know, could have been answered if they read the email that was just sent out. So I think we've kind of shifted with the kind of communication pressures here. But I think communication with students, I think, requires a very special approach. I think a lot of students, particularly grad students, feel very kind of stuck or pressured or really just kind of feeling like they don't know what comes next. And so I think a lot of the communication that I've done both in my own faculty and working with FGSR, the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research at the U of A, has really focused on trying to show what the path forward is, like what are the next steps, where can they go? So we've spent a lot of time particularly, say, communicating on theses and dissertations and how to modify those, because a lot of students, you know, how do you do a lab-based thesis if you can't access your lab, and how do you do community-engaged dissertations if you can't, you know, go to the community? And so a lot of this is, again, focusing on what is possible. We're trying to compile like a list of databases and electronic resources that students can access, different kind of primary resources, and really just kind of encouraging them to think about ways in which they can do innovative and new things, and not see this as a set of restrictions, but maybe as an obstacle that's going to kind of create innovation and change and allow them to develop skills they may not have developed otherwise by, say, accessing online resources. And I think that's like an interesting kind of way to kind of approach this is what is the pandemic allowing us to do differently? What can we kind of do in a way that kind of changes it? And I think this webinar is actually an excellent example. I believe it was this week we were all supposed to be, you know, in Winnipeg doing, you know, an in-person, well, a couple of courses. We can't do that. So this is, I think, in some ways does provoke innovation. This kind of disruption can allow us to think about things differently. And I think there's an opportunity to see that as a positive and not just as something that is a restraint. You know, and I think this is where the communication and the like empathizing with the situation and then trying to turn it into a glass half full situation, I think can be effective, particularly with students that are in many ways facing a lot of different stressors.
Thank you, Adam. And I think it is important to recognize that, for example, graduate students working towards completing a thesis, a dissertation, finishing their field work, their lab work is stressful enough. And then you add this disruption. But thank you, Adam, for reminding us that disruption can present opportunities as well as challenges. So with that in mind, we're going to shift to the third question, which is focused on leadership, because one of the things that CHURD has done very well, in my opinion, over the years has been to provide individuals like all our participants today, including the presenters, with opportunities to develop their leadership skills, which in times like these become extremely important, how that leadership is is practiced. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn things back to Tom Chase and ask Tom to lead us off on the question about what styles of leadership do you think have been particularly effective in these unprecedented circumstances?
Thanks for that question, Sheila. There are a couple of things that I'd want to point out to the group and later on hear from them on. First of all is presence. Virtual, obviously, in this case, but presence. You need to be present to your campus. People feel alone. They feel adrift. Many of them very, very worried about the future. Many of them struggling psychologically at being apart from their teammates on campus, struggling in home environments that aren't conducive to working. You have to make sure that they know that you are there. Flowing from that immediately is compassion. There are a lot of stresses in the workforce. As Adam has just said, grad students among the student side feeling particularly worried about the future, seeing delays in their field work that could set them back for a year. There's a lot of worry and stress, and you've got to show compassion. There's also, quite frankly, a little bit of whining going on in some quarters. You even have to be compassionate about that and say, look, we do have a global pandemic, but we hear your pain, and we're trying our best to take account of that. I think third, I would point, you have to be firm. You cannot wobble. So that's not a contradiction with compassion. You show compassion, but you have to be firm in your decision making. There's a lot of back and forth between groups who want to get back to campus as quickly as possible and those who are truly frightened to come back into an environment in which they feel their health may be at risk. So once a decision is made about clearing out the campus, about not returning to work normally in the fall, about what we're going to do for the winter term, you need to be firm, articulate your reasons very carefully and compassionately, and make clear that unless the situation changes dramatically with the introduction of a vaccine or the disappearance of the pandemic, which isn't going to happen, we need, first of all, to hold health and safety above all else. And finally, I just say, you gotta set some things aside. Focus on the crucial. Right now, we're all trying to keep the institution stable. We're trying to keep enrollment stable or up slightly. We're trying to protect our revenue streams. We're trying to figure out what to do with huge drops in ancillary revenue, how we will pay the bills next year and the year beyond. Focus on the essentials, institutional stability, continuity, and the health and well-being of your faculty and staff. Let other things go that are not essential at that point. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to call next on Dana to share her perspective on that same question of styles of leadership.
Thank you. Yes, it is interesting in times like this of crisis where you do see the very different leadership styles and, you know, what's more effective or not, because as Tom just said, everybody reacts differently. And so along with all of the things that Tom just said, which are absolutely key leadership factors in a time like this, I think it also is a bit to, you know, even though I agree with you, Tom, in terms of being firm in the decision making, the huge part of that is communication, because you're making decisions, you know, sometimes in a vacuum, and that is very uncomfortable for most people, and they want, you know, very firm answers early on, and it's not always possible to have those decisions made because things are changing. Well, almost daily, at least at the very beginning it was. So there across campus, there was a huge requirement for answers and not always the ability to give them. And so that communication style, that calm, which comes back to the presence in terms of leadership, to say that there is leadership, we're working this through, and the ability to admit that we don't have all of the answers and that there may well be the need to change course. And I do think that that is key, because people are seeing that in their daily lives, and so it's definitely a thing, an attribute of leadership to be able to make some of those pivots that may well be necessary as we get more information. And I think the other big thing on leadership is really setting those principles up front so that you get your leadership team behind you on some of those very key principles, which would be like the compassion and so on. You know, the health and safety of our staff, students, and employees are most important. So some of those key principles and priorities. And I know at our institution, one of those principles was that we're in this for the long term. So we're not going to make any short-term decisions that will implicate the long-term, that will have negative long-term implications for the institution. And so keeping some of those principles in mind, I think, are key. And you know, some of my fellow presenters have talked about the communication and sometimes the over communication and people not reading everything, and I think in the end that's a good thing, because the worst part is not having the information available. And I think the huge thing is involving our, you know, all of our faculties and the deans and the students in some of these key decisions. And what we did at Queen's was have an academic operations group, a research group, and a campus operations group. And I think that was key because people knew where the leadership was and where to go for some of the decisions. So I think that was key. So I'll leave it there, but some of those key attributes, I'd add patience in there too, Tom.
Thank you very much, Dana. And our third presenter on question 3, Adam, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I guess I should start by saying in Alberta we've had a kind of sense of external threat for a lot longer than the pandemic, with several multi-year cuts that really kind of, you know, it's like cutting bone at this point. Like they're pretty deep, and so we've been struggling with that even before the pandemic. And so I think that has colored a lot of how the university community has responded to how leadership decisions were made. And I think a lot of the kind of early decisions, particularly the pass-fail decision, which was quite controversial at the U of A, was kind of motivated by this. And I think in some ways people are feeling like collegial governance has not been followed through, or you know, and it's tough because I think that was the right decision and it needed to be made quickly, and the alternative would have been probably worse. But I think there's kind of a general feeling on campus now that collegial governance has been limited, and while it's not really operating that anymore, I think that there is a sense that there was a cost to making those quick and necessary decisions. And it has kind of provoked resistance among faculty. Like I heard stories from some of my students of their profs who were quite student-centered, out of I think an act of resistance, just giving all of their students a pass and canceling the course 4 weeks early, right? And so, or ending the course 4 weeks early. And so we had these kinds of challenges, and it's still an ongoing debate over academic freedom, whether moving online is an infringement on academic freedom, and all these kinds of things that I think are largely outcomes to how the decision was made, not what the decision was. And so this is kind of, you know, impacted, I think, by the cuts and this kind of feeling that we're under threat as an institution, not just because of the pandemic. But I think this is where the collegial decision-making process, what the panelists were talking about in the first question, I think is really vital to maintain. That when people feel like they're not being heard, which I think has been the case to some degree, and I think people feel like they're not being heard by the province, so this is a much bigger issue than just the university, but it can kind of erode trust. And I think a lot of my colleagues feel like that trust has been eroded. And so there's this kind of ongoing challenge at the U of A as we kind of enter now some fairly serious restructuring, that these decisions need to be kind of broad-based, democratic process needs to be followed. Yeah, because I think there's still kind of this kind of ill will, particularly at my university, about how that decision was made by at least a vocal part of the faculty. So I think this is where trying to maintain normalcy as much as possible is really vital. And even if quick decisions need to be made, like I think they need to follow the process, because I think that in a lot of ways has upset people. And kind of being kind of outside of the kind of senior administrative ranks, I feel like a lot of people do feel quite frustrated by the situation. And I think, you know, and I don't say this as a critique to the university, I think this is kind of how things would have always ended up and needed to end up. But just with these kinds of multiple factors, it can be really challenging for faculty to navigate. And I would return again to the communication and you know, what was said by my fellow panelists about empathy and compassion, but firmness, and kind of moving towards understanding where people are coming from and the additional challenges and needing to learn new technologies and radically alter their courses on a fairly short timeline.
Great.
Thank you, Adam. I think what our speakers have reminded us of is that leadership is really leadership style is a matter of strategic choice, and that we are confronted as leaders and prospective leaders with options as to how we handle situations. And our panelists have really highlighted what some of those key choices have been at the start of the decision making back in mid-March, but how things are starting to evolve over time. And again, the link to collegial governance is very, very important that we remember that. And the choices that we make in terms of leadership both reflect and are reflected in the collegiality of governance. And I think the points that were made about the importance of maintaining trust, showing compassion and empathy is a big piece of that, speak to the kinds of leadership choices. And I particularly think that this is a time when we need to reflect on the fact that humility is something that should probably characterize leadership styles going forward, because we do not, as leaders and prospective leaders, have all the answers, and we need to say that, and we need to find the support and encouragement and assistance where we can. Having dealt with those first three questions, we're going to shift the focus to the kinds of questions that you might have, and I'm going to call on Kathleen, who started us off today and who has been tracking and curating the questions to tell us what's on your minds as you participate in this webinar, and to have our panelists respond to your questions. So Kathleen, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to start with a question that's actually directed to all of the panelists, but we'll actually start with Miles, and then we can you can all provide some comments. The question is, I'm curious to hear from everyone about your university's decision to go online for the fall and subsequently for the winter, because I think if people read recently, some UK universities have already said that we will be online until the term 2021 in the fall. So I'll turn that over to Miles, and then we'll go to George and Tom and Donna and Adam.
Thanks, Kathleen. So at Bishop's, after an analysis done by our working group consisting of faculty, students, managers, and union representatives, there was a recommendation to adopt a hybrid approach to our fall and winter 2021 academic year. So we aim to be offering as much as possible where students can come to Bishop's or want and feel safe to do so, that we will be offering them as much as possible on campus, while at the same time offering a variety of experiences, either in a hybrid way, either a combination of in-person activities on campus and synchronous and asynchronous delivery remotely. And some of our courses will be delivered exclusively online with a combination of pedagogies. I would also like to say that we surveyed all of our returning students and all of our prospective incoming students as part of the decision-making process. In addition, the government of Quebec has been, well, some days it's driven me crazy. Did I say that publicly? They have changed their mind quite a bit, and have been at one point issued a directive. The Premier himself issued a directive or an aspirational goal that all universities and CEGEPs in the province would be offering 30% of its programming in person on campuses. Since then, the directives have been a lot looser. This happened. This was issued. The state directive or statement was issued after many universities had already announced that they were going to deliver their programming in an online way or almost exclusive online way in the year. So you can imagine the frustrations amongst many. Luckily, we had not made our decision fully public, and our decision to offer a hybrid or blended approach was very much in line with what the government was expecting or the goals that they were setting out. But having made the decision, it's not straightforward at all, as I know all of you can appreciate, and we're all living through the complexities of enacting it.
Thank you, Miles. Just moving on, I just saw that there was an additional part of the question, like think about the rationale for a short term or semester, longer term move online. I think there was some interest in that. I know we're all sort of making decisions as we go. Perhaps, George, if you'd like to respond.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, in fact, just this week, UNB provided a full breakdown of what all of our courses will look like. So students, faculty can go in and highlight their own faculties and their courses to see whether they'll be offered in alternative delivery methods, whether they'll be in person or whether they'll be a combination of both. New Brunswick, as you may know, is having something of a better time of it than some provinces, but that hasn't minimized the challenge that we face. We're working very closely with the province through the mandatory guidelines that we're receiving and the work that we do with the Office of Public Health. And we're very cautious as well because we have an older campus, like many of you participating today. Some of our buildings are quite old, in fact, and it's difficult to be able to provide the full access for physical distancing there. So we needed to do a full operational breakdown of the strategy of all of our buildings and all of our faculties. We went right out to the deans, and we put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the deans and their decision-making authority here. I think perhaps more so than any other group on the campus, the deans have more to say and they have more influence in the decision-making here. So we really relied on them in the creation of their course scheduling and their operational plans. And from that, we were able to assess certain classes at the graduate level, laboratory classes, practically oriented classes, some classes, like for instance, the fine arts in drama and music, which through proper physical distancing, we will be able to offer in a blended format, alternative as well as in person. Roughly about 20%, I would say. We did a rough calculation today, and it's roughly around 20% of our classes will be available in an in-person format. And that might come as a surprise to some because our situation in New Brunswick is better than in some provinces. But one issue that's really weighing on our minds is the very real possibility of a more severe second wave. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, that very abrupt change to moving to an online or alternative delivery format for all of our institutions, the swiftness that we all needed to utilize to move people off our campuses, we're mindful of that. And we want to be sure that whatever precautions we put in place, that abundance of caution needs to allow us to protect ourselves from another swift shift that we may have to make in the fall. So by easing ourselves into the fall term, looking to see what we can do in a blended format, and then perhaps looking into the winter term, hopefully things will improve a little bit. We may be able to open up a little bit more. And the last thing I would say is I would far prefer to be criticized for taking an abundance of precaution than trying to open up widely and bring in as many people as possible, only to have the chaos that could ensue if we were to move in hundreds of students to residences only to have to turn around and move them out. And the reason why I say that is because I think that the long-standing and the more long-term effects of that type of negativity would have a much more and dire effect on our institution than even what happened in March.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments? I know there's one more question that I'd like to have a chance to ask all of you. Any comments, Tom or Donna, in addition to what's been said?
Miles and George have covered it very well. I'd simply add this, and maybe it's something we can come back to later if we have time. I find it fascinating in a small jurisdiction like Saskatchewan, our entire post-secondary population in the province is smaller than the U of T. The two universities, Sask Poly and the regionals, altogether are smaller than the U of T. So there's been a great deal of sector coordination. And I wonder if the situation we've all moved through over the past couple of months will continue to promote a greater degree of interinstitutional communication, and some would argue perhaps a little loss of institutional autonomy as the sector tries to move with some degree of sameness so that the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina are not out of step on things like what is going to be offered and what is not, how we treat students, how we react to requests for tuition reductions from students. So we're seeing a greater degree of sector coordination. We made that decision with regard to the fall term as a sector and announced it as a sector on May the 12th. One of the things we might talk about later is that will that continue? And does that maybe constitute a little bit of loss of institutional autonomy? So I'd add that thought.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Donna, anything further?
Just to say that, like everywhere else, it's a very difficult decision to say that you are going to go primarily remote. And so we aren't doing the hybrids. We went with our medical faculty, so nursing, rehab, medicine will all be in person, and we're going through those logistics right now. So it's just those programs will be in person in the fall, but everything else is remote. We're not having classes for everything other than grad students will be on campus, and so very difficult decision for a university where the secret sauce is the broader learning environment, the student experience, and that is the secret sauce at Queen's. And so I can say that the decision was made, and that was one of the decisions that everyone wanted to be made. You talk about leadership, wanted to be made very early on. And we could all see the writing on the wall, but it was a very difficult decision to come to that conclusion that it had to be primarily remote. So I think that's all I would add to that. It wasn't an easy decision. And I can add more in terms of some of the stuff later in terms of working with our faculty associations and so on through all of this.
Okay, and the other question, which I think will come very much in the second webinar, but I thought it was interesting, how your institutions are approaching planning for the long-term new normal that might emerge.
Did you want a quick response?
A very quick response, because I know it'll come out in the second webinar, but maybe Tom and Adam, if you could respond.
Sure, very quickly, in addition to the bodies that Donna has described at Queen's, where we have almost identical operational bodies on the academic, research, and operations side, we've established a little think tank comprising the Associate Vice President of Finance, our Central Risk Manager, and two very highly skilled faculty members, and we call them the Recovery Planning Group, and the Brains Trust. They're not operational. They're there to scan the horizon, to gather information, and to make recommendations to the executive team about 18, 24, and 36 months out. The head of the group is a virologist who actually works on COVID. The second person is a specialist in risk. The third person is an accountability specialist from the business school. And the fourth person, as I say, is the person who knows where every dime in the place is. And we're really excited about the work they're doing.
Thanks very much. Adam, any comments?
Yeah, so my faculty, again, we're quite small, but given kind of the lemons we've been given over the last few years, the solution, the making of the lemonade, we've actually kind of focused a lot on online learning as a future, both source of outreach and source of revenue. And so building kind of additional online courses. We had a very successful MOOC that came out of the Faculty of Native Studies, Indigenous Canada, which had 30, or I think it's up to like 40,000 now, 40,000 different learners take it. And it's been integrated into like public service training and stuff. So we've had a lot of success with that. And so it's now kind of using this experience it's kind of caused a lot of our faculty to upgrade their online learning skills quite quickly. And so trying to think of ways in which these sorts of skills, again, can be used kind of to move forward in ways that might, affect a changing educational landscape, offering courses online as students might become more comfortable with that, and ways in which support the long-term interests of the faculty and also the students that we teach. And so trying to think of ways that, we can, take a glass half full approach and try to make some new resources out of the kind of challenges we've faced, which I think is a common kind of Indigenous studies approach to challenges. We're often under-resourced, so it's how we can kind of maximize the situations that we often find ourselves in.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for posing some questions to everybody, and I look forward we have a chance at the end. And now I'll turn it back to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Kathleen. In some respects, in your responses to those questions from participants, we've started to segue into the fourth question on our list, which is about the kinds of issues that arose as universities pivoted to online course delivery, and what can be learned from that experience. And you've started to speak about that. So I'm going to call on Miles and George to just ask if there's anything you want to add to what's just been said that specifically responds to that particular question. So Miles, I'll call on you first, please.
Sure, thanks, Sheila. Well, I don't know how much you know about Bishop's University, but we're rather small, 2,700 student population, primarily undergraduate residential community. Teaching remotely is not what we do. It's not our model, it's not our brand, and very few of us had much experience teaching in a remote way before this. And then we have this assumption here that other universities have much more experience than we do. So that was one, maybe it's a false assumption, but certainly we have been doing very little of this. So there was a very steep learning curve, almost straight up in the air. So that was number one challenge. Very little infrastructure, no instructional design expertise. We had some faculty with some experience. So it was a very quick investment in new tools, platforms, activation of a peer support group, working with the Maple League, all of whom do not do this much more than Bishop's does. We have benefited from the Information Technology Association of Canada, who are co-funding some. We've hiring 25 technical assistants for our faculty members. That doesn't sound like many, but in our context, that's a lot. Instructional design team. Some of the other issues, one of the big issues are deep ingrained assumptions and beliefs that anything done remotely is much less effective and much less interactive rich than the in-person experience. And indeed, we had some demystifying of what the research literature actually says about the potential of remote delivery, a delivery mode being to enact interaction-rich pedagogy. So that was one of our challenges, and we're continuing. We're not going to change beliefs overnight, and some of our people are never going to agree that remote delivery is anywhere adequate. And so that was one challenge. The second, we have the faculty workload and the faculty trauma of in dealing with this very swift, immediate change. Then we have international students for whom there's a significant challenge. One, a significant reaction. They didn't come to Bishops. They didn't choose Bishops because they wanted to study in a remote way and online. So it's coming to terms with either sticking with it at Bishops or enrolling. So therefore, we've got the enrollment worries and enrollment and retention challenges attached to it. I could go on and on, but I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Miles. George, what would you care to add to that?
Well, thanks. With regard to challenges, the first challenge was the logistical. We made an abrupt change. All of our courses had to shut down, and we gave ourselves a week to prepare, and then the following Monday we had to get things started up again. So we had to have a lot of faith in our people and our technology, and thankfully we did have a fairly healthy technical team and an extended learning team to work, and we did manage to get things up and running, and there weren't any real hurdles that first day. A second challenge was pedagogical, moving people to a new form of delivery, specifically alternative delivery, because I know that this is the same at some universities, but certainly at UNB, online means something in a collective agreement. So online also is a very different model than what we were doing. And our extended learning colleagues would remind us that we were not actually doing online courses. We were doing alternative delivery, and there were some very important distinctions there. But the pedagogical aspects were challenging. We were blending and combining methods. Faculty who had never done anything like this in this context were suddenly engaged in a new mode, and they needed a lot of supports. The technical side was another challenge. We were moving faculty to what might have been under or unutilized remote methods, and our technology was strained as a result. We needed to provide devices. We needed to provide high-speed internet access for some students and staff. We actually had some staff showing up in their cars in the parking lots and getting permission to use the wireless in the parking lots because it was stronger than their home wireless. We have a lot of students in rural areas in New Brunswick, and so they had trouble gaining access. Fortunately, it wasn't as serious an issue as we thought it would be, but we were able to deal with it on a one-on-one basis. There was the challenge of faculty time and compensation. We deal with our faculty association on a weekly basis. Members of the executive team meets with our faculty association weekly, and this issue comes up again and again. Compensation for what is perceived to be additional work to be able to provide the courses in an alternative delivery format. There's the challenge of getting students engaged with the alternative delivery format. They're also critical of the quality of the education they're receiving and constantly trying to remind them of what they're getting is important. For our colleagues in British Columbia, the open letter from the BC provosts, I think, is a really important and positive step in the right direction in terms of encouraging students to see what they're going to be getting in the fall and what the universities are trying to do. Financial is another challenge. The cost went up. We suddenly were investing dollars that we had hoped to look at maybe down the road. Suddenly we were needing to look in a much more nimble context. And finally, I would say in terms of what we learned from this, absolutely investing in your technology and expertise. That goes without saying, but for a lot of institutions, some institutions in our region, we were helping because they didn't have online platforms. And so we were assisting with them, and I'm sure that they are now moving in their own direction in terms of their own technology. We realized that we needed to be nimble in terms of our in terms of our programming and in terms of the structure of our courses. And finally, I would echo a comment that's been made by several people so far this afternoon, which is the importance of a supportive and transparent network, ensuring that from the senior executive team down to the faculty administration and the units themselves and student services and supports, all of that needs to be transparent, open, seen to be open so that people can understand they can still gain access. And that constant communication, I think, is important. Maybe not daily Miles messages, maybe that's too much at this point, but constant messaging, I think, is absolutely essential.
Thank you, George. And I think from some of the things that I read on a daily basis, there is still a great deal of anxiety on the part of both faculty and students in the shift to online learning. And I read a letter to the newspaper today from the president of one of our local faculty associations, speaking about the fact there's basically 3 months to make the shift to online learning and teaching for the fall. And I think that's, and another colleague speaking about how ill prepared they feel to be doing this. So we all recognize in these comments that it's still a challenge that lies ahead. But as our panelists have said, when you're focusing on dealing with the initially short-term and now the longer-term implications of the pandemic, something has to give. So our next question is about what strategic initiatives had to be shelved, we hope temporarily, in order to address the challenges of COVID-19. So I'm going to go back to Miles and ask him to speak particularly about what strategic initiatives had to be put on hold in this situation.
Thanks again, Sheila. I'm going to identify two that had been paused. One, we had begun to embark on a campus-wide strategic enrollment management planning exercise, a rather large undertaking with support of consultants, and we had just completed phase one, or an assessment of our practices and policies and strategies, etc., when COVID closed our campuses in March. So that process, then we did set that aside. The intention was to keep the momentum going, to analyze the assessment report, and to move forward with creation of multiple committees to examine and set out a series of goals, strategies, and tactics for the next 5 years in terms of optimal strategic enrollment management. We have just reactivated that process. In fact, this weekend, we had a workshop that was facilitated by our consultants, and we hope to ensure that this process gets back on track. Of course, it will include a short-term pivoting to recover from what we anticipate will be an enrollment shortfall for the fall and winter 2020. We were very much in a growth perspective, and that's overall what our strategic plan is aiming for. But right now, all signs are that we will be experiencing a setback. The second example is a campus-wide reorganization and strategic growth and development of our experiential learning plans. And that one so far has been paused, but I now have a meeting set to reactivate and reignite those plans going forward, and very much in line with the strategic enrollment planning process, as well as these are two overall goals and strategies that will overlap and intersect as we look at planning for the long term.
Thank you, Miles. George, what had to be shelved from UNB?
Thanks, Sheila. What was it Adam said? And I didn't think that I'd have a problem, but you make lemonade. The silver linings exist out there, and one of the silver linings, from our perspective, was the timing of this thing. Literally, the week after we had to shut down the campus, we were intending to run a new strategic plan. I had chaired a strategic plan development process. It took us around 2 years to do the whole thing. We had the plan and the glossies and everything ready to go the following week. And then, you can insert the sound of the needle scraping across the record if you're a member of vinyl records, for those of you out there. And we all looked at each other and said, what are we going to do about the strategic vision? And my advice was to the president, nothing. Just move ahead with the tactical planning and we'll come back to this. Well, that's actually been a good thing, because had we moved ahead with the strategic plan that week following the shutdown of the campus, we would have been talking about, growth in international students in the fall, which of course we're not going to be seeing. We probably would have moved ahead in some different initiatives on campus programming that we won't be able to do, at least for now. But some of the other things that we had in the background that were going to be coming forward progressively, issues like developing our UNB online platform and focusing more on learning and micro-credentials and laddering degrees and those kinds of things. Suddenly we looked at those and said, well, those look pretty attractive, don't they? So we've kind of done a shift around on our visioning, and we're slowly now beginning to look at, well, what would a fall rollout of our strategic vision look like? Well, we can take out these modules of what the plan was shaping up to say, and we can focus on those. So in some respects, we had to shelve or delay almost everything because of the pandemic. But the advantage has been that by focusing on research innovation as a core aspect now, focusing on online and graduate studies expansion into micro-credentials, and as I say, laddering programs, partnering with other institutions, that's meant that we've necessarily had to take some time to reconsider, but now those priorities are going to be coming at us from a different direction. And frankly, I think we'll probably come out of this in a better place to be able to more nimbly move and be able to be flexible in our planning into the fall. So we did our best to create the lemonade. It remains to be seen in the fall how people respond to that. But thank goodness for timing, and thank goodness we hadn't launched it the week before. I don't know what we would have been saying right now.
Hey, thank you, George. Adam, anything that you'd like to add to those comments about the kinds of things that you saw having to be shelved, at least for the time being?
Yeah. So my concern is not that something necessarily has been shelved, but I think there's a lot of concern about future austerity. I think in Alberta, austerity is already here. But I guess want to make a pitch that equity, diversity, and inclusion and indigenization policies should not be seen as like luxury items. Like they're not something you do when there's a lot of money around or you have a budget surplus and can reallocate some stuff to faculty or staff lines or something like that. But to treat it as something that's actually core to the mission of the university, right? And I think there's three reasons for that. So first, is that there needs to be intellectual diversity at a university. I think for a long time, we've acted as if a small subset of European-derived knowledges are universal human knowledge, and we're now at a place, I think, where we can all recognize that's not true, that there's a huge diversity in human knowledge from across the globe. And if universities are meant to be these spaces for human knowledge and the exchange of ideas, that all of that needs to be part of the university culture. Sami scholar Rona Kokkonen wrote a great book on this from UBC Press. And so, yeah, I think that treating a diverse university as a place for diverse knowledge is really important and is not just for good budgetary times. Second, our student bodies, particularly in big urban campuses like mine, are incredibly diverse, particularly at the undergraduate level. There's an increasing number of international students, and increasingly our student body, the makeup of the student body does not reflect the faculty and staff at universities. And I think students are aware of this fact. And so again, this is I think part of our core mission is that our student body and our faculty should reflect one another, right? And because it's ultimately the students we're training to become faculty and staff at our institutions. And third, I think not to treat EDI and indigenization as some sort of charitable exercise, but again, foundational to the university. We're at a point where we're having a societal level discussion about systemic racism right now, which I think is an excellent kind of segue into this kind of dialogue on our campuses. But EDI and indigenization is necessary not because of a lack of interest about certain people working at a university or attending a university, or because there's some sort of difference in ability, but rather that there are systemic barriers that prevent a lot of people from accessing the kinds of jobs or opportunities that other people can access due to essentially arbitrary physical characteristics. And so I think thinking about ways in which EDI and indigenization are central parts of the university, that are central to the university, is vital, even if we enter kind of times of austerity. And not to see this as something we can only do in the good times, but is actually very much a part of a successful university over the short and long term, and making sure that it reflects the people we serve, ultimately the students, and the citizens of the province that pay for a lot of this stuff. And Alberta is quite a diverse place. Edmonton is quite a diverse place, and I think it's important that people see that reflected in the universities, the big public institutions that they support.
Thank you, Adam, for reminding us of the importance of the centrality of diversity in the life of the university and of the society of which it forms a part, which is a good segue, I think, into our final question about how the relationships both within and beyond the institutions have been affected positively or negatively by the circumstances of the last several months. And certainly, as we have just been reminded, universities are a key part of civil society, and we cannot separate ourselves from that society. We are integrally linked. And so to respond to that, I'm going to call upon Tom first.
Thanks, Sheila. I'll begin outside the institution and then move in. As I said earlier, the Saskatchewan community is very small, 1.2 million as a province. It's a population of Calgary, and that has promoted a lot of interinstitutional discussion. And I would say that one thing that has come out of this is a very strengthened and very positive and supportive relationship with the Ministry of Advanced Education. We have a very engaged and knowledgeable minister, a very good ministry staff, and they've really promoted, without getting into interfering with institutional autonomy, a lot of interinstitutional communication and, if you like, some collaboration around things like the cancellation of term and so on. It's been very useful, and I think that will serve us well going into the future. Similarly, regular contacts with our partners in the system. We have a weekly call between the minister, the deputy minister, and the presidents, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, to touch base on any issues. That's been very productive, and I hope that that will continue into the future. Into the institution now, the relationship with the Board of Governors, to go back to our first question on governance, has again, I think, been strengthened. We are very fortunate at this university to have a very dedicated and engaged board. One of our rules is no surprises. And so I am basically in daily or near daily contact as it's needed with the board chair, who then in turn contacts the board as necessary. And the sense that the board is there to support the university, to guide the university, and in effect to have the administration's back in difficult times is incredibly valuable. With faculty and students, again, I can't say enough good about the way that the faculty collectively and individually have stepped up to the plate in these incredibly difficult circumstances. It certainly has put stresses and strains on people. There is the question raised earlier about additional compensation, what the implications are for future contracts and collective agreements. But so far, we could not have asked for more from the faculty and the staff who support the faculty in delivering teaching and research. Students, it's a bit mixed. Student union depends on the day. We have a bit of a campaign right now for a reduction in tuition. We froze tuition this year and we reduced a lot of fees or suspended a lot of fees with a total savings of close to $5 million for our students. But there are those who are pushing quite hard for a tuition reduction. And again, as a sector, we are not able to do that and have decided collectively that we're not able to go down that path. For staff, again, I want to be tremendously complimentary to the staff. There's probably a little bit more stress and strain among some members, just given the demographics of staff and the fact that many of them are women with children, what it's like to try to work from home when you've got kids for whom you are responsible and you may be homeschooling in some cases. And finally, the deans and the executive team. This has really brought these groups even closer together. We do have a wonderful leadership team on this campus, and working through these challenges has promoted a sense of common purpose, and we're in this together that I don't think anything else could have achieved. So that while none of us would have wanted a pandemic, there are, as one of the speakers said earlier, there are some silver linings to this cloud. And I'm just very glad to be a part of a team that is working so well in these circumstances. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. And Donna, final word on our set of questions to you.
Just a couple of things, because all of what, although I have to say, different from what Tom said, we don't have that connection to the provincial government here in Ontario as strongly as Tom has said. But locally within Kingston, working with the local college has been important. The other really strong connection, which has helped us significantly, they were actually on our daily leadership team calls, is the public health. So from the very beginning, they have been lockstep with us and been really helpful in terms of our local public health has been incredible. On the and just going back to what George and you, Sheila, mentioned in terms of faculty, challenges. We did enter into a letter of understanding with it was a COVID-19 letter of understanding with our faculty association to address many of the issues that we have talked about here today. And it's in effect until August 2021. It's a temporary agreement. Also with our staff unions, we negotiated with them COVID-19 temporary leave arrangement, so that it's temporary, and they bought into that. That's for a 34-week period, very temporary, so that we could do furloughs under that. So that really helped in the relationship building with our employee groups, which was really important. One of the things that, and all of the governance stuff so the only other one I would add that we are concerned about, I was trying to think of a negative one, is on the community, because even though the vast majority of our students will be studying remotely, we are concerned that many upper year students will, because they have their housing, will return to Kingston. And that second wave that everyone talked about, that probably will happen because there's a vast majority of students coming from elsewhere that will be in town. I think the university has a responsibility there and will have to wear it, even though they're not supposed to be there, but they're going to be there anyway because they have their student houses. And so that's one thing that we're concerned about in terms of our community, because Kingston has been really blessed and we've had very few cases. And so we're in a bit of a bubble that will likely burst when a lot of students come back. So that's something that's on the radar.
Thank you very much, Donna. So that brings us to the end of our 6 questions. I'm going to turn things back to Kathleen to see what other, I know we're kind of running a little tight on time, but Kathleen, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. We had one question that came up, and I think it's something that we're going to be talking about much more in the webinar on Thursday, where we look at what was emergency short term and how do we pivot it to long term. But the question that came out is, what are universities doing to support a more intentional fall online preparation, different from an emergency pivot to a full semester being delivered remotely? Examples are learning designers, equipment for faculty at home, student demand. And maybe I'll just ask Tom to just say a quick 1-minute response, because we are running late, and I think it'll be a bit of an opportunity to give us some things that we'll be thinking about on our next webinar, which is on Thursday, same time, same place, where we'll be looking at what we're doing going forward.
Sure, thanks, Kathleen. And very briefly, you've already touched on some of the things. Additional support for faculty who require that support to deliver a very, very good learning experience online. So we've hired a number of students with skills on co-ops. We've provided more co-op experience for those people. We've made equipment available to faculty and staff. And indeed, those who need to set up or need some help setting up home offices, Various of our faculties are exploring ways of doing that or have already put that in place. We're doing everything we can, again, to go back to a much earlier comment, in the consciousness that it's not going to replace face-to-face. We know that, but we will commit to doing our best and providing whatever support necessary to faculty and staff to make that happen. We look forward to exploring that in more detail on Thursday.
Okay, thank you. Well, coming to a close, I'd really like to thank the panelists and the moderator, and thank all of you for your time today, and for those that had to arrive late or leave early, or colleagues who got called away to meetings, you'll have an opportunity to view this on the CHURD website as soon as we can get it ready to go up. So thanks a lot, and I hope that we'll meet again on Thursday as we look forward to the future post, or hopefully not during the second wave of the pandemic. Thanks very much, and stay well, and we'll talk in 2 days. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.